So far, we've been looking at styles that change really just the appearance of text. But I want you to appreciate that styles can also be used to do things like align elements on a page and create margins and padding around those elements. So let's open the green sea turtle page. And you'll see here there's an image that isn't aligned. You may also notice that these have borders around them. I'm going to change this border to 0. And up here I'm going to change this border to 0. That's the easy way to get rid of borders once an image is linked to something. So what I want to do is align this image to the right-hand side of the page. Now I already have some styles in my external style sheet here that I could use, so I don't want to confuse you by the fact that they already exist in this site. But I'm going to recreate these, create some new styles so you can see how these work from beginning to end. So essentially I'm going to create one style for floating elements to the left and one style for floating elements to the right. I'll name them slightly differently and I'll save them in an internal style sheet. So what I want to do first is create a new style. This is going to be a class style. Class styles work especially well when you're doing things like creating styles that will be used for aligning elements on a page. And something that you use to align things to the right and left is probably a style you're going to want to use over and over again. In fact, almost all of the CSS layouts that come with Dreamweaver include styles that are already set up for you for aligning things like images to the right and left of the page. So the styles I'm about to show you are incredibly common styles. Most web designers include something like this within their style sheet. I'm going to create this one only in this document, just so that I don't add a duplicate style to my external style sheet. But what I want to do here is create a name that helps me distinguish between right and left. So I'm going to create a style called float-right. Click OK. And now the same old CSS rule definition dialog comes up. We've been mostly using these text formatting options from the type category. But I want you to go now to the box category. This is the area of the CSS rule definition dialog that you'll primarily use when you're creating styles for things like div tags and images where you want to have padding or margin or you want to align things. So the first thing I want to do is choose float right. When you align something to the right using CSS, you float it to the right. So just get in your head that anytime you want to align something right or left, you want to set a float option in the box category. Now, I'm also going to add some margins. And we'll talk more about margins in the next chapter, but just to give you a quick idea, margins add space to the outside of something, like around the outside of this image. Padding adds space to the inside of something. So if you're creating something like a div tag, which as you'll see essentially just creates an empty box, you might want some padding inside that to create space between the edge of the box and whatever's inside it. If you want space between the outside of something and whatever's next to it, you'd use margins. So when I float this image to the right, this text is going to come up on the left. And I'm going to want a little margin between that image and the text so that it doesn't bump right up against the picture. Now we saw in an earlier chapter that you can use V space and H space, and we're actually going to remove these settings when we do this. But V space and H space add a little space to both sides of the image, whereas in CSS, you can very specifically add margins only to the top, bottom, left, or right. So think with me here. I'm going to align this image to the right. I'm going to float it to the right. The text is going to float up on the left, and I'm going to want to create a margin on the left side of that image to separate it from the text. So I'm going to add, let's say, 10 pixels of space here on the left side of the image. And let's add another 10 to the bottom of the image so that nothing bumps up against the very bottom. But I'm not going to add any margins to the top or the right because I want this to align into the top right corner of the design. I don't want it moved away from the right side. You'll see how this works in a moment. Now when I click OK, you'll see that I've now created a new style, it'll be on the bottom here, a new internal style called float right. And it's got right and it's got margins on the bottom and left settings. If I select my image, I can get rid of that V space and H space, and you see that just tightens it up to the left. And now I can apply that class style. So if I choose float right, and again, I named these separately to help you distinguish. This is the one we just created, float right. You'll see instantly the image is moved over to the right. A little bit of margin space is applied on the left here to create this margin between the text and the image, and a little bit to the bottom so that we don't end up with text writing up against the bottom. But notice here on the right-hand side, there's no space, whereas H space would require that there be extra space on both sides. With the margin setting in the style, I can have this flush up against the right of this box. So I've created an align to the right style. I'll bet you can guess that you could create a similar one to align things to the left. And here's a nice little shortcut when you're working with styles. You can actually duplicate existing styles. So instead of creating a new style, I can right-click on that style name, choose Duplicate, and now I can just rename it. Instead of being Float Right Copy, as Dreamweaver is offering, I'm going to call this Float Left. Click OK. And you'll see now I have a style called Float Left, which is an exact duplicate of Float Right. Now I could change the settings for this right here, so I could make this Float Left instead of Float Right, or I could double click on it, go to the box category, and make the changes here. Because the other change I want to make, in addition to aligning things to the left with this style instead of to the right, I'm going to want to change the margin setting, because now the text is going to be on the right-hand side. So instead of having 10 pixels of margin on the left, I'm going to want 10 pixels of margin on the right. Click OK, and you see those changes automatically applied to that style. And now, if I come down to this image and I select it, I can change it from float right to float left. And you see instantly the alignment changes to the left and the margin is created on the right.